Welcome to our discussion of World War II, and this lecture will be divided into three parts. Now, the first thing you might notice looking at the title slide are the years 1933 to 1945. From your previous studies, you certainly know that the war ended in 1945, but you may be surprised to see 1933 here, since the United States, after all, only entered World War II at the very end of 1941. However, I'm taking a broader view of World War II here. I'm not looking just at U.S. involvement, although we will look in great detail at U.S. involvement. But in 1943, as we'll see in a few minutes, the beginnings of World War II occurred in East Asia with Japanese invasion of portions of China. I'm not going to go into great detail in these three lectures on the many military battles during the war. That would take many hours and is really beyond a survey course like this. If you're very interested in specific battles, have a particular interest in that myself, I'd be happy to recommend books or videos on any particular topic. Now, before we start looking at the origins of World War II, I want to spend a moment talking about the important role of intelligence or information on the enemy. Now, in general, there are three major types of intelligence. One is political and economic. The other is strategic. And the last is military tactics, specific battle plans or troop movements. But by far the most important intelligence and the most useful for leaders is to know the intentions of the senior leaders of the enemy that you're at war with. Now, when we looked at World War I, you'll recall we looked at the Zimmerman telegram, and we saw this same slide. This is the famous Zimmerman telegram, in which the German government in 1917 sent a message to the German embassy in Mexico City. And this, of course, is a coded message, as I described in a previous lecture, in which the German government invites the Mexican government to invade the United States, and in return, the Mexican government would regain territory that Mexico lost to the United States, such as the Southwest, including Texas. Now, this was important, as we saw in World War I, because British code breakers had been able to read the plain text of this message and pass that on to President Wilson in Washington. However, after World War I, the Great War as it was known then, and supposedly, as President Wilson said, the war to end all wars, we saw in our discussion of the 1920s that the U.S. returned more or less to isolationism. The Europeans were also very tired of war. And in the United States, there was a great movement, as we saw, towards normalcy, returning life to normal, with the result that the United States gained very little information or intelligence on potential adversaries. And in fact, it reached the point where in 1929, Henry L. Stimson, who was the Secretary of State at this time, said in a famous quote, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail," because he had been given a message written by a foreign leader, a confidential message, and he thought that this was not ethical. So because of this position, he closed the State Department office that deciphered or decoded messages from countries like Germany and other countries. Now, of course, the deciphering or decoding of messages is not done within the State Department, but it's done by the NSA or National Security Agency. But at this time, it was an office in the State Department that did it. And it may surprise you that given this mindset, during the 1930s, the United States had no intelligence officers overseas to gather covert intelligence. Now, intelligence officers are not, quote, spies. Intelligence officers are case officers who recruit spies, but in the popular movies they're called spies. So here we have the United States of America essentially knew very little about other countries. Now, I'd like to speak for a minute about various types of intelligence sources. The reason is intelligence became much more important in World War II than in previous human conflicts. And I have much personal experience with this, having worked as an American diplomat for over 30 years. I worked literally on a daily basis with our intelligence agencies and read the intelligence. So you have two major categories of intelligence. One is called human intelligence, or abbreviated HUMINT, and there are two forms of this, covert and overt. So intelligence, think of information. What's an example of overt information? Well, reading the newspapers in a foreign country. Depending on the country, you may or may not pick up information, useful information from reading the newspapers. It's done by all our embassies around the world, watching television shows, and even more important, going out and meeting people, talking to people. When people have confidence in you, particularly if they've had a few drinks at a party, a few glasses of wine or something, people will often provide information that they might not want to provide. And that's called overt. It's not clandestine. Nobody is paid for the information. And as a diplomat, I obtained much information, or collected intelligence, if you will, of that type, and sometimes very, very useful information from people, particularly foreign government officials, who should not have given me that information, but they disagreed with the policy of their government, or sometimes they even provided documents. That's overt. Covert, as the name suggests, is clandestine. And this is largely the role of the Central Intelligence Agency case officers overseas, who go overseas, and there are people who are willing to provide information either for money or for ideological reasons, or because they're mad because they've been working for 25 years in a government ministry. They have access to all sorts of information, but they're frustrated because they haven't received a promotion, or they don't like their boss, or they feel somehow they've been hurt, and so they want to pass this information. And they're not going to do it at a cocktail party. They would do that on a covert basis. So that's human intelligence. HUMINT, which was very important in World War II and continues to this very day. The other broad category is signals intelligence, or SIGINT. As the name suggests, this is information obtained by signals. Now, this could be radio signals, telephone conversations. In this, you also have technical intelligence, for instance, putting a microphone or a bug in someone's office, which was done during World War II, and it continues to be done at the same time. Now, if you want to read the intelligence of foreign militaries, if it's confidential, it's put in codes, and so you have deciphering. And the Ultra Project, as it was known, was a very top secret effort in World War II, which was successful, which led, as we'll see a little later in the lecture, where the Allies, the US and the British, Canadians, Australians, were actually receiving virtually all of the orders that Hitler sent out to his generals. And in fact, it was so efficient near the end of the war that US and British officials were reading messages from Hitler to his commanders about the same time the commanders were getting them. So they were intercepted and deciphered, a fascinating subject. And if you're interested in it, there are many books about it, and there are quite a few videos available on Netflix, Amazon Prime, etc. Overhead photographs during World War II, of course, they didn't have satellites yet, but they often had reconnaissance aircraft who would take photographs, detailed photographs, and those were interpreted by analysts. Of course, today, most of that overhead photography is taken by satellites, which are very sophisticated in addition to normal photographs that you and I might be able to take with very, very sensitive cameras. They also use special technologies, infrared and other technologies, to obtain information from overhead, or in other words, from the sky. And there are other categories of intelligence, but these are just the two main sources. And again, the reason I mention this is they're of crucial importance during the war. Both sides, the Allies, the United States, and Europe, the Axis, which was, the United States and Britain, largely, Canada, Australia, and then the Axis, which is Germany, Italy, and Japan, all used intelligence quite extensively. Now, what happens when information is collected? This takes on crucial importance in World War II. The German intelligence network was very good, particularly in intercepting radio communications. But the German intelligence agencies were afraid to send negative information to Hitler and other senior leaders. Why? It was not a democratic country, and Hitler and the senior Nazi leaders valued loyalty above everything else. They valued loyalty more than truth. So this was a major, major issue, a negative issue affecting the German military effort. So after the war, when the archives were taken over by the Allies, they found many, many quite accurate military and intelligence agency reports that had been prepared in Germany, but they hadn't been sent to senior German leaders. And interviews with the defeated German military and intelligence officials indicated that they were terrified of sending such negative information up. For instance, the fact that such and such a German military unit wasn't doing very well in the field, or that they had learned this or that information, because if Hitler hadn't liked it, he would have fired or perhaps sent to prison the people providing the information. And in fact, during the first 2 years of the war, when Germany was winning the war, certainly winning the war in Western Europe, they had excellent tactical signals intelligence, and that helped them win the war. Now let's move on from intelligence, and you'll see, we'll talk a little more about that as we move into this. So one question is, why did the United States enter World War II so late? When we talked about World War I, we saw little desire in the United States to enter World War I. It was viewed as Europe's conflict. And the same thing happened in World War II. It was viewed as Europeans squabbling with each other, and we'll talk about this in more detail. But the United States, again, did not enter until December 1941, when it was attacked, of course, by Japan in Pearl Harbor, and a few days later, Germany declared war on the United States. Now, our interest in looking at World War II, and in fact, everything in this course, is not just looking at the facts of what happened. Obviously, we have to know the facts, we have to know what occurred, but we want to really focus on why it occurred and its significance or legacy, including its legacy to the present day. And one reason I believe studying World War II is so important is it has a great legacy that continues to the current day. Now let's look at the roots of World War II in Europe and Japan. Uh, First of all, there's a lot of talk about fascism, contemporary politics. People call each other fascists. But, what is a fascist? I think the term today is being used rather loosely. A fascist is really, or a fascism is a system of government. It's a radical form of totalitarian government. That means a dictator, and the dictator's government controls all aspects of life. There are no free elections, or if there are elections, the only candidates are from the ruling party. There's certainly no freedom of press, of media. There's no freedom of expression. University professors who publicly disagree are shipped off to a prison camp. And this was the situation in both Germany and Italy. Partly, it was motivated by patriotism. In Germany, racial superiority, which we'll talk about more a little later. And for Germany, great resentment from the Versailles Treaty, which ended World War II. You'll recall from our study of World War I. You'll recall from our study of World War I that under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, which Germany was reluctant to sign and only signed it after France threatened to invade Germany if it didn't sign, Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war, total responsibility for the war. And in addition, Germany was required to pay a huge amount of money or reparations for the damages it inflicted on the Allies. And I can't overemphasize the amount of resentment this caused among the German people who felt that they'd been harshly treated. Now in Italy, the leader was Mussolini. He was known as El Duce, and in Italian that means the leader. And his goal, he was very egotistical. His goal was more to recreate the Roman Empire, and he modeled himself on the first Roman emperor or dictator, Augustus. And Mussolini was not so motivated by racial superiority as the Germans were. It was just, sort of a classic dictator. Now, in Germany, Adolf Hitler, whose title was the Führer, which in German means leader, he was the head of the Nazi Party. He had been elected, and once he was elected, he abolished the Constitution and very skillfully and ruthlessly used the SS and other elite military and police units to kill the opposition. He believed very strongly in the master Aryan race, the perfect German, blonde hair, sort of, looks very, quote, Germanic. And he believed that that race was superior to all others. He often referred to social Darwinism, which we looked at fairly early in this course. And he said, just like in the animal kingdom, among humans and the Aryan race is the superior race. And he believed in eugenics. He believed that people who were not Aryans, the women should be sterilized so they shouldn't have children. And then, of course, this evolved into his policy of extermination, not only of the Jews, but as we'll see in a few minutes, of around 6 million other people that were not part of the master race. This is a photo of Hitler. Behind him on the flags are the swastika. And it's important to recognize the fact that he received massive support from the German people. Those who, not everybody, of course, supported him, but those who didn't support him were afraid to say anything, or they were eliminated, in other words, killed or sent to prisons. He provided the German people with a lot. He provided them with radios. He made sure every household had a radio. He was the one who wanted to have a people's car so everybody could have a basic car, and started the automobile factory known as Volkswagen, which still exists. And Volkswagen in German means the people's car. He built extensive highways, and he felt, and he quoted the Roman emperors who felt, well, the people don't really need democracy. Keep them happy. And in the case of the Roman emperors, as you probably know from your study of ancient societies, the Roman emperors provided food. Nobody would die of famine in the Roman Empire, free bread, and circuses. Not circuses like we think of circuses with clowns and elephants and things, but circuses in terms of chariot races or gladiator matches, which were free. So Hitler had studied history, and in his writings he often cites the Roman emperors, like Mussolini did. And if you recall your studies of Rome, you'll recall the first 500 years of Roman society were a republic with a form of democracy, and then that switched to the empire, which was dictatorship. And so Hitler did not believe in democracy, certainly, and he believed that he could keep the people happy. And there was a lot of support in Germany for Hitler and many, many of his policies. Now, Japan wanted to control Asia. They also believed that they were the master race within within Asia. And they certainly felt that they were superior to the Chinese and other Asians. By 1941, after, and we'll see in a minute, the German and Japanese expansion, there were only about 12 democratic nations in the world. Think of that, 12 democratic nations in the world in 1941. So literally a handful of democratic nations. All of Europe was under Hitler or allies, and in Asia, Japan had spread out. And I'll show you a map in a minute on this. So Germany, under Hitler, formally renounced the Versailles Treaty, and the goal was to unite German-speaking Europeans, because there were Germanic people who spoke German living outside of Germany in countries that had been set up after World War I, countries carved out from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, such as Czechoslovakia. Hitler, the Nazis, very much wanted what they called living space, Lebensraum, living space for the German people, the Aryan people, to expand. And, of course, the Nazis very much wanted to rid the continent of the Jews. And we'll look a little more at this, but it's important to remember, and hopefully you've studied this in previous courses on world history, Hitler did not invent anti-Jewish feeling. It runs back many, many, many centuries, with many Christians blaming the Jews for the death of Christ, and throughout the Middle Ages, and Jews were persecuted throughout Western Europe. Now, let's look a bit at the geographical expansion of the fascists. In 1931, Japan took over Manchuria in northern China, just moved its army in and took it over, and because it wanted the natural resources, particularly coal and iron ore. Japan is a small island nation, much of it is mountainous, and it's very resource poor. So much of its expansion in Eastern Europe is due to its desire to acquire resources. And in 1935, Germany moved military forces into the Rhineland. This is the area between France and Germany, which had been set up as sort of a buffer state after World War I. There were German people there of German descent who spoke German, and so Germany just moved forces in. And what happened? Well, nothing happened when Japan took over Manchuria. There was no reaction from the United States or Britain other than saying, oh, that's terrible, that shouldn't happen. The League of Nations, which you would call had been set up after World War I, the United States hasn't joined. Many countries denounced Japan, but those were just words. So Japan took over Manchuria. In the case of Germany, France and Britain did nothing, and that convinced Hitler that the democracies were cowards, that they were afraid to fight. This is a map of, as you can see, of Asia, and this is, see in green, the areas of Japanese expansion before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Because many Americans think, well, the war started with Pearl Harbor. Well, it didn't. American involvement did. So you can see Japan, sure you know, a small island nation, very mountainous, and really doesn't have a lot of natural resources for modern industry. I've circled in red Manchuria, which was forcibly taken over by the Japanese in 1932. Korea had been acquired from Japan earlier after a previous conflict. And then you can see, you don't have to know all the dates or anything, but you can see the green area, Beijing, the capital of China now, taken over in 1937. A lot of the coastal area moving down. French Indonesia in 1940. French Indonesia today are the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, of course. And why did the Japanese want French Indonesia? Well, there are a lot of resources there. And then the Japanese had their eyes on Southeast Asia, which then was called the Dutch East Indies, now sort of Indonesia, that whole area, because of the rubber plantations. They needed rubber for their industry, and particularly their war machine. So this is where we are before Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Now let's turn to Europe. So this map is a little difficult to see all the details, but if you focus on the big picture, you have in green the Axis powers. This is Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. And this map is 1935 to 1939. This is before Great Britain and France went to war with Germany in September 1939. And you can see, I've circled in red, the Rhineland. It's a very small geographically area between France and Germany, which, as I mentioned before, Germany moved military forces in and simply took over. And the French and British and the United States did nothing other than verbal protests. And so this convinced Hitler that, well, he could just do whatever he wanted to. And then you can see to the right or east of Germany, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, where German forces moved into Austria and Czechoslovakia. And you can see there they moved into Poland on September 1st, 1939. And that was really the beginning of World War II in Europe, because that event triggered Britain and France joining the war. Now let's look a little at Spain. You can see Spain there. The fall, it says in red, the fall of the Spanish Republic in March 1939. And we're going to talk for a moment about the Civil War in Spain, how Germany supported the fascist who was trying to take over, who actually did. And this is a direct precursor to World War II. Okay, as I mentioned, you have a civil war in Spain in which there are at first no outside assistance. You have the fascists, the military, and supporters trying to take over a democratic government. Then you had Germany and Italy supporting those fascists, and the head of them was Franco, who later became president. On the other side, supporting the democracy, you had volunteers. The emphasis here is on volunteers from both the United States and Europe. And they mainly came from the Soviet Union to fight with the Republican government because they felt it was important to defeat the fascists. During the war, during which there were many atrocities, the Germans, for the first time, used dive bombers. These are bombers that come in and then they go, as the name suggests, they go down low, drop their bomb to be very accurate, and leave. They started doing this of civilians because the Germans were testing the technique, and their theory was by bombing the civilians will support having a fascist government. Well, ultimately, the fascists took over. Franco took over, and he remained dictator until his death in 1975. Now, so for almost 40 years, he remained the dictator in Spain. So Spain was a total dictatorship until 1975. Then, of course, it became a democracy. Now, this is a famous painting by Pablo Picasso called Guernica. Guernica was a city in Spain in which the Germans engaged in mass bombings of civilians. And if you're familiar with Pablo Picasso's work, this is sort of typical, but you can see what he is trying to convey here is the mass destruction. You have even animals, being torn to bits, and of course people being torn to bits, and building being torn to bits by the German bombing of civilians. In 1936, Italy moved in to northeastern Africa and took over Ethiopia. Now, the League of Nations met in an emergency session because remember, the League of Nations was set up to prevent war, and there were protests and diplomatic notes and set up sanctions against Italy, but it really had no impact on Italy. So this emboldened Mussolini, and Hitler was watching this too and said, we can sort of do what we want to. All they'll do is protest verbally and perhaps have some sanctions. I mentioned a few minutes ago, Japan, meanwhile, was at war in China. There were many, many atrocities, well documented, committed by the Japanese soldiers who ran amok in the famous rape of Nanjing or Nanking, China. Many foreigners observed Japanese soldiers moving in and just raping every female they could find. And there were roughly 300,000 Chinese murdered in that area. And we'll talk a little later about some of the theories as to why the Japanese soldiers committed such atrocities. So in 1937, a formal alliance or Axis was set up among Japan, Germany, and Italy. And then the same year, Germany united with Austria. Excuse me. Well, what was the United States' response to this? Well, United States, well informed of what was going on. People would read the newspapers. There would be newsreels during movies, or they'd listen to the radio. And this just convinced most Americans to become more isolationists. Oh, that's a rough, tough world out there. We don't want to become involved in Europe's problems. And what Japan is doing in China, oh, that's terrible and all, but most Americans said, why should we become involved? It's not our problem. And of course, you got to remember the United States was still in the midst of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, as we saw in the last lecture, really didn't end until the late 1930s. So most Americans, said, let's just deal with our own problems. And many quoted George Washington's famous farewell address that we've looked at before, where he said, stay out of foreign conflicts and, particularly European affairs. Now, Charles Lindbergh, whom you recall became famous by flying his small airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, across the Atlantic Ocean, he was the most famous person in the world, safe to say. Still very, very famous in the United States, a real, outspoken person on many issues. He spoke at many events against U.S. involvement in European affairs. And in fact, he was invited to travel to Germany, a personal invitation from Hitler. And he met with Hermann Goering, the head of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, who admired Charles Lindbergh for his aviation feat. And Lindbergh was very, very impressed with the German Air Force and the advances being made. And he came back and told Americans how wonderful the Nazis were, and they had the wide support of the German people and were helping the German people. There's a short 3 or 4 minute video in the module I encourage you to watch. It's actual film of Charles Lindbergh speaking at what's called an America First Committee. This was a very, very popular group in the United States that, as the name suggests, America First. Let's not worry about what's happening in Europe or Asia. Let's worry about America first. So again, that's in the module. It's like a 3 or 4 minute video clip. Now the Munich Pact. Be sure you know what the Munich Pact is for the exam. And also, to this very day, and I'll show you one example, people often bring up the Munich Pact. In 1938, France and Britain agreed in writing that Hitler could take part of the country of Czechoslovakia. The part of the country was called Sudetenland. It was the western part of Czechoslovakia. And the majority of the people who lived there were German-speaking people of Germanic ancestry. And remember, Czechoslovakia had been set up after the First World War. And the hope was to appease Hitler. That will make Hitler happy. He wants living room, for the people. He wants to reunite all the German-speaking people. So here we go. Now, Winston Churchill was very skeptical. Winston Churchill, of course, became the famous British Prime Minister in World War II. At this point, he was not in the government. He was not in the government. Neville Chamberlain was a British Prime Minister, and Winston Churchill would stand up in the Houses of Parliament and criticize this, and people would boo him and say, oh, he just wants to have a war. Let's go back in our time machine. And now we'll be criticizing here for a few minutes the Munich Pact. But you got to remember the massive destruction and death caused by World War I in Europe, much less in the United States. Of course, there was no physical destruction in the United States, but there were deaths. And the last thing in the world Britain and France wanted was another war. And so people were desperate for peace, and so they thought, well, maybe if we just let Hitler take part of Czechoslovakia, he'll be happy, and then we don't have to go to war again. So people were really, really tired of the war. So what happened is British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had several meetings with Hitler. He came back from the last meeting with a signed agreement. And he held up a piece of paper, which was the agreement with Adolf Hitler. And he held it up and said, this is signed by Herr Hitler, or Mr. Hitler. And, Chamberlain said, thanks to this, we are having peace in our time. In other words, we won't go to war. This is a very, very famous speech that people still talk about today. And now this means a policy of appeasement. In other words, giving your adversaries what they want in hope that they won't ask for any more. You appease them. So that's a policy of appeasement. There is a short 2 or 3 minute video in the module. Again, you should really watch this. It shows British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain walking down the steps of an airplane, returning from his meeting with Hitler. The press is there, the microphones, And he makes a short statement saying, we're now going to have peace. And, the crowd cheers. And many people in Britain and France said, this is wonderful. Chamberlain is a hero because he has prevented a war. Of course, events showed that Hitler just viewed this agreement as yet another sign of British and French weakness. Now, people, and I'll show you a slide in a minute, of people who disagree with certain policies, most recently the nuclear agreement with Iran, often cite the Munich Pact. First, this is a photo of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain holding up the document that he and Hitler had signed, in which Hitler said, in essence, I promise I will not take any more territory after Sudetenland, this part of Czechoslovakia. This is all I want, which of course was not all he wanted. Now these I found on the internet, and this is just to show you the current relevance of the Munich Pact. This is not a political statement, whether I agree or disagree. It's just to show you the political impact. So this is one photo. Appeasement didn't work then in World War II, won't work now. And the issue, of course, was critics of President Obama for having joined the Europeans in signing a nuclear agreement with Iran. And here someone has sort of photoshopped the photo we saw of Neville Chamberlain, put President Obama holding up the same piece of paper. And it reads, Obama, America's Neville Chamberlain. Obama says, give appeasement a chance. Appeasement is, and then whoever put the advertisement in said, appeasement is death. There is no security, no safety in the appeasement of evil. And this just goes to show you your study of history is relevant, because you would not be able to understand this sort of argument if you didn't know what the Munich Pact was. Well, now the sad story continues. After receiving the green light from France and Britain to take Sudetenland, Hitler quickly just moved in and took the rest of the country of Czechoslovakia. He didn't ask for permission from France and Germany. Those were weak democracies. He just moved in and took the rest of Czechoslovakia, and guess what? France, Britain, the US did absolutely nothing. Well, they protested and they said this was outrageous, and they had some economic sanctions. But this emboldened Hitler even more. Then in 1939, there was an event that sort of shocked the entire world. Hitler and Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, signed an agreement. They signed an agreement saying they were allies. Why did this shock the world? Well, it shocked the world because Hitler hated the communists. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, in addition to expressing great hatred of Jews, he'd expressed hatred of the Bolsheviks, in other words, the communists. And so there were many, many people who were shocked with this agreement, which, as we'll see, lasted 2 years. Well, in September 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, independent country of Poland, and what they did is they had German forces, military forces, blow up a German radio station in Germany, right near the border with Poland. And then they claimed that the Polish had sent military forces in to blow up the radio station. Well, the next morning, many hundreds of thousands of well-trained German soldiers, tanks, airplanes rolled into Poland. And shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. and the Polish people suffered many, many brutalities. This is one of the most brutal battles of World War II, with many, many executions of Poles, particularly Jewish Poles. And when the dust settled, the fighting was over. Germany and the Soviet Union divided up Poland. Well, the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, was too much for Britain and France, and they immediately declared war on Germany. So, September 1939, we have a formal war in Europe. And of course, the United States did not declare war for over 2 years later. This lecture will continue in part 2. Thank you.